Neil Lazarus. Educating, motivating, challenging.
Welcome to another podcast. For those of you who have been listening, you guys have gone crazy. We just hit the 22,000 download mark. Remember, you can get these now on Spotify, iTunes, and everywhere else. I've discovered these podcasts going up everywhere, where even I haven't put them. Just a little bit of background. One of the most popular programs that we've been running, and I saw this on my lecture tour recently, and we've got another lecture tour coming up. So look out. If you haven't yet booked me, remember, there's still a few places left. One thing, the subjects that came up were particularly how people liked personal interviews. And one of the people I meet and spend time talking to after my presentations are people who are making a difference in their community. We had on our broadcast before, and if you haven't heard it on this podcast, listen to some of the interviews we did with Kay Wilson, who was a survivor of a terrorist attack. We've also had other individuals who've gone against their community, including Israeli Arab 19-year-old who went against his community and volunteered for the Israeli army. So many of our people, and much of what interests me in particular, and I know you, are people who are standing up, making a difference. So first of all, I'm delighted, and if not honored, to have today on the podcast is Manny Waks. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Neil.
First of all, for many of our listeners, as you know, like I've just mentioned, are activists in the community, and they're fighting against injustices. It could be a Jewish voice on campus saying, that Jews should have a right to support Israel on campus elsewhere, maybe people in the community. And then we had people like Kay, and we had other individuals coming along. For those of us who are not Australian, although my accent sometimes gets accused of being, I could do a good fake one if you want, mate, is for those people not familiar with your story, can you take us back to when you were 11 years old and basically your life was changed?
Yes, it was. I grew up in an ultra-Orthodox environment, more specifically within the Chabad community in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm one of 17 children. It's a very large family and a strong part of the community. And I was sexually abused as a child from the age of around 11 or 12 till 14 and a half by two members of the community, or people who were involved, not just as members, but with different roles. The first one was a Baal Koreh. He used to read the Torah in synagogue every Shabbat. And then the other one was in charge of security, karate teacher, and both of them were obviously part of the Chabad community. So that did happen to me when I was a young boy, not knowing about the issue of sex, let alone sex abuse, but that issue of sex education and those types of issues were never discussed with any of us.
Do you think the Orthodox community in the background enabled you to be more easily groomed?
It's a very good question, and I think the issue is that there's insufficient research to really be able to tell us if these issues of child sexual abuse is more prevalent within the Orthodox community than it is anywhere else. But if we look at the basic statistics in Israel, in the US, and in Australia, for example, the government uses the 1 in 5 statistic. 1 in 5 children before the age of 18 will be sexually abused in some form. It doesn't necessarily mean rape. It could mean exposure to pornography. It could mean inappropriate touching, but it could also mean rape. So it just demonstrates how rampant and how prevalent this issue is in our society.
So we talk about grooming and how young children are. It just doesn't happen overnight. It's not just an attack. People groomed, and your experience carried on for 2 years. What's the process? How are children who are so obviously manipulated and easily manipulated, how do they fall victim?
Yes, the term grooming has now surfaced, and we're all being educated about what it actually means. And what it means in the context of child sexual abuse is that a person, a pedophile usually, but it's not only a pedophile, because a pedophile is essentially someone who is sexually attracted to children. But not all pedophiles necessarily go on to become abusers and go and carry out their fantasies, essentially. But those people, I essentially identify their target based on the vulnerability usually, and going back to the question you asked before about within the Orthodox community, I do believe there are increased vulnerabilities within the Orthodox community. For example, having very large families, reliance upon a fellow member of that community, even though they have no idea who the person is, as long as they look the same and as long as they pray hard and are part of the synagogue and community environment, they automatically are accepted as someone with full trust. So the grooming process essentially means that this individual will identify their target and will provide them with whatever they think is necessary in order to gain their trust, their love, often everything in that person, because it's more than just trust. As a 11 or 12-year-old child, and of course it happens in all sorts of ages, but that was to me, it was an ongoing process in identifying what my needs were. Being a member of a large family, not receiving attention, or as much attention perhaps as I should be receiving, a child that age, you go to find it elsewhere, and the pedophile will position themselves so that they are that person that you seek. And it's not only about grooming the victim, and myself in that instance, it's also about grooming their family and grooming their community, because they gain the trust. And, Velvel Serabransky, my first abuser, was a regular at my house. He was at my bar mitzvah even after the abuse finished. So there's that kind of process. They groom the victim, they groom the family, and they groom the community in that they position themselves in all sorts of tasks and roles that if and when they want to carry out their misdeeds, and then later on in life, they are always... people will look at them and say, no, impossible that someone like that did something. So my second abuser, for example, David Tsipras, who's currently sitting in jail, he was on all sorts of boards. He was on the board of the Council of Orthodox Synagogues of Victoria. He was on the board of Glenira Synagogue. He was an active volunteer in the community security group. So 20 years later, when someone does come out and say, he sexually abused me, the instinctive response of many community members is impossible, because he's such a good man, such a good person. Meanwhile, they don't quite realize his dark side.
What made you break the silence?
A very difficult question in terms of an exact time of what did ultimately motivate me to speak out publicly. When I was 20 years old in 1996, I went to the police. I was in the middle of doing my army service in Golani in Israel, and I went back for my sister's wedding. I happened to hear something on the radio. There was a police operation called Operation Paradox, which encouraged anyone with information about child sexual abuse to report it to the police. That was the first time I'd ever considered going to the police, and I went downstairs to my dad's office and informed him for the first time of what had happened and what I had just heard in terms of the police. To his credit, he actually contacted the police immediately, asking a few clarifying questions because he was obviously in a state of shock. And I gave the police a statement, and he also did. And they went to interview my second abuser, because my first one, Velvet, was already in New York, so they couldn't speak to him. And this is obviously in the mid-90s before the use of the internet. So they spoke to the second abuser, David Tsipras. He denied everything at the time. And they came back to me, it's your word against his word, insufficient evidence. We're not going to shut the case, but we'll leave it open pending further information. At the same time, I went to Rabbi Groner, who was the head of the Yeshiva Center, and he was fully aware of it and basically told me there's no need for me to do anything about it because he's dealing with it and the person's getting psychological help, and the rabbi was on top of the situation. But at the same time, they kept David Tsipras in his role, karate teacher in charge of security with restricted access to children. So that was in 1996 when I was 20 years old. So I was in the middle of the army, and then I'd done what I thought I needed to do in order to pursue justice and to protect other children by going to the police, by going to the rabbi. But essentially I had the door shut in my face. So that was a very difficult thing to accept, but I tried to move on with my life. And to speed up a few things, of quite a few years later, when I returned back to Australia for good, I used to walk past this centre and still used to see David Tsipras in charge of security. In fact, I had to go to the Yeshiva Center occasionally for my family occasions, and my brother's bar mitzvah and all that kind of stuff. And Tsipras was still there in charge of security, essentially having to give me permission to come into the synagogue, which was ludicrous. So basically the issue didn't go away, but I tried to move on with my life at the same time. I then, at some point in the mid-2000s, 2006, I got a job with the Anti-Defamation Commission, and that was my first interaction with the media and having an understanding of what it is, how they do their work, and how I could potentially utilize them. And that's when the idea first surfaced of, I've done what I could as an individual. Maybe this is time now to go to the media and share my story in the hope that it will open it up. For a range of reasons, we decided against it in about 2006 because of we were having children then, and there were taboos, and it's obviously a lot of stigmas attached to this issue, and we just felt it's better for the children if we don't. If I fast forward then a few years, 2011, a number of things happened without going into too much detail, but the main development was that I had then been appointed for over a year, around a year, as the vice president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, which is the peak body. And I just thought that if I am a leader within the Jewish community and a senior leader at that, I need to take a leadership position on this issue, because if I don't, no one else will.
So your allegations rocked the Australian community, or at least the Orthodox community.
Absolutely, it did. People were shocked. It was front page news on July 8th in 2011. And as a direct result of that, it definitely caused shockwaves in the Australian Jewish community, and even broader than that, because until then, the public discourse was about allegations of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. And here we had occasionally, you might hear about, the Salvation Army or other groups, but it was unfathomable to average community members, whether in the Jewish community or beyond, that something like this could actually happen within the Jewish community, because no one had uttered a word about it. And so within days, weeks, months, suddenly the police were becoming inundated with allegations of abuse, both in relation to one of my abusers, David Cyprus, where within a few months they were receiving countless calls, and they did say at some point that they had about 15 individuals alleging that David Cyprus has sexually abused them at yeshiva as well. So it definitely caused that. It's a snowball effect. And not just with David Cyprus, my abuser, not just within the city of Melbourne, but suddenly allegations surfaced in other institutions as well, with Maccabi. So it's not only within the Orthodox, it was also a sporting group in Maccabi, and a number of the girls went there and they approached me. In a lot of these cases, they approached me for advice, support, and all of that, and I did what I could. Yeah, so there were a number of people within the Jewish community across Australia, Melbourne and Sydney, who were convicted of sexually abusing children. There was also, not just on the reactionary part, there was also preventative moves happening where parents starting to talk to their children around this issue. Community organisations dealing with children suddenly started taking an interest in ensuring that they have robust policies and procedures in place to prevent it and to address it if and when it surfaces. So it really did change the entire landscape in the Jewish community in that context.
It's weird. When I'm talking to you, it's like there's a sense of you haven't let go. Is there a stage, and again, when I talk to other people who are, and I think the word victim is wrong. I think survivor is much more positive. In other words, on the one hand, you were a victim as a child. Today, you're a survivor as an adult and a man who has a very strong voice. Has this become who you are? Is it part of who you are? Is it obsessive? I wake up in the morning and this is what I do? Or how's it affected you?
I think it's important to differentiate between different people, those who experience what I experienced, and myself in terms of what it is I do. So first to the issue around the victim, survivor and all that, there are different terminologies used. There's also a thriver is the more modern age one. Personally, for me, it's just it feels like a bit of a game. I'm a bit uncomfortable also with the issue of survivor, because growing up in the Jewish community, survivor had connotation. It was,
right, especially in Australia. Right.
Exactly. So per capita, it's the highest number of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. So yes, that was an issue, and certainly was for me. And I do know others that have also raised it. I used to say a past victim, probably the most accurate, but really, I realised over the years it doesn't really.
It doesn't really matter, right?
Well, not to me. It does matter to a lot of people, and I generally, when I'm describing people, and when I speak to them, I either say victims or survivors, but generally survivors, because I know that's probably the majority do feel that way, and I think you make a very valid point. And in terms of your second question about, is it who I am? Does it define me? So I was making a difference in that not every victim is like me. Not every victim or survivor ends up becoming a victim's advocate. So I have chosen that path, not by choice, because as I was saying before, in 2011, when the story broke open, it really, in the beginning, it was very welcome, getting a lot of support. But then again, within a few weeks, within a few months, the tide started to turn. It was, okay, you've raised this issue, now go away and be quiet. You're assisting the anti-Semites, which was quite ironic given the fact that I was lauded in Australia for being a very effective anti-racism campaigner on behalf of the Jewish community just a few years before then. So there was a lot of pushback. My parents, for example, did support me at the time, and they were excommunicated by their community, by the local Chabad community. I mean, the head rabbi Yeshiva, who was the son-in-law of the late Rabbi Groner, who died in 2008, got up and publicly attacked me and my family inside the synagogue. And this was corroborated in a court of law context, with the Australian government launching a government inquiry into those matters. So it was really a very difficult process, but as much as perhaps I would like to deny that it's something that will define me and does define me, it does, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's obsessive. I certainly, over the years, I've gone through different stages. At one point, perhaps I would have been obsessive. I've gone through a stage where perhaps we'll get into that in terms of the impact of the abuse and also the impact of becoming a victim's advocate in this space. It took a massive toll. Now,
what is the impact? I mean, is it similar to post-traumatic stress? Is it?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so in terms of the impact, so each person who goes through it has their own impact, and it could be different for different people, and some of that depends on, for example, who your abuser is or was, how long the abuse went for, how bad the abuse was, your level of resilience, what happened when you shared it, disclosed it to someone, what was their response? So all of those things are important factors in all of this. But if we're talking both personally about myself and about many people who I've experienced, who I interact with, it's very common for victims and survivors of child sexual abuse to be diagnosed with things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, suicide attempts, a whole lot of different addictions, eating disorders. And that is all based on research that victims of child sexual abuse have those things at a much higher rate. And I can tell you that personally, that has been something that I have gone through as well. All of those things, or most of those things, and it's something that I learned to live with and had to go through a healing process. And I still go. I don't think it's an ending process. It's something that goes on. I mean, I see therapy and focus on meditation to try to ensure that I can function in society, because there was certainly, I would say, a period of a number of years over the last few years where I was at my lowest, and I can genuinely say very fortunate to be alive this day, because the impact of both the trauma of the abuse and then the trauma that was caused by the re-abuse by the leaders of the community in their response to this issue. And then add on top of that something that's called vicarious trauma, when you're dealing with, as a victim's advocate when you're dealing with many other victims and you're hearing their stories, that you end up experiencing their trauma as well. And so that's what's called vicarious trauma. So I've learned now over the last few years to better protect myself in a range of ways, including, for example, to deal a lot less with victims and survivors of child sexual abuse and focus much more on the broader picture.
So have you had successes in prosecuting other people?
It's not my role to prosecute, but I would say that I've had a lot of success in terms of raising this issue and encouraging other victims and survivors to pursue justice, to go to the police. And as I was indicated before, in Australia, for example, there are a number of people who were convicted after my story, and I know quite a few victims and survivors did pursue justice as a result of that. And again, not just in Australia, but this is globally, certainly within the Jewish community, especially within the Jewish community, but also broader than that. I often hear from people from around the world who have said, I saw your story, or I saw your documentary, or read your book, and I was inspired to go to the police or pursue justice or pursue healing because I've never gone to therapy.
What's the name of your book, and what's the name of the NGO that you created, and how do people contact you if they want to reach out?
Sure. So the book is called Who Gave You Permission, which is a quote from that head rabbi inside the synagogue where he was giving his big sermon, a week or two after my public disclosure in the media, where he asked, who gave you permission to talk about this publicly to me and my family? That was the indication. So that's the name of the book. And in terms of the NGO, the not-for-profit organisation that I founded in Australia, I established an organisation called Tzedek, which means justice in Hebrew, which focuses only in the Australian Jewish community on both victim support and advocacy. And that's still working and going well, apparently, and good for them. But in Israel, I'm focusing much more on a global scale in the Jewish community. Don't do victim support, but it's called Kol Va'oz, Kol meaning voice, Oz meaning with Ayin, meaning strength or courage. And this is really about raising awareness around this issue. So I do a lot of traveling all over the world. I was just in New York twice in the last month, for example, focusing on the Child Victims Act that they recently passed there to provide.
Do you have a website where if people want to contact you, reach out to you, invite you even to speak? How should people contact you?
KOLVOZ.org, kolvaoz.org. But also if they Google my name, I've got my own website as well, Manny Waks, MANNYWAKS.com, and they can get in touch that way for whatever reason. And even if victims contact us and survivors, I refer them to the appropriate places so they can get support.
I hope there's someone who's listening to this podcast in the same way you first heard a radio program in the day and you thought you could be changed, who's anxious, perhaps a victim, but is reluctant to speak out. What would you say?
I would say that the most important thing is to do what is most comfortable for you to do. Everyone has their path. No one should ever feel pressure that they must pursue justice, because going through a process such as that is harrowing, is challenging at every level. So it's not something that we all jump into. The sad reality is that out of the 20% of society, we said, that gets affected by child sexual abuse, only around 10% of them will ever go and disclose it to anyone. And then only a small fraction of them will go through the judicial process, and only a small fraction of those will actually end up with a conviction. So it's a really complex issue. Most important, it's about self-care. Don't feel alone in that they look after themselves and their needs. They should not feel like there is no hope, and just because they've been traumatized and abused in different ways does not mean that they cannot have a very effective and productive life. And what they need to do is to really try to reach out for help, whether it's through therapy, whether it's family, friends. Often it needs to be a combined effort by all of those different parties, and we all need help, especially when you go through such a traumatic event. And it took me decades to realize that. I only started seeing therapy at the age of around 40 in a consistent way. So it really is important that there is self-care, and then once there is self-care, you're a much better place to be able to not only be a functional human being in society, but also to look at potentially pursuing justice or doing whatever else it is that you need to do for yourself.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Manny.